Hi Metro, this week you're looking at Journey Through the Wall with the life of Abraham. Every one of us hits walls. I'm sorry, there's no exceptions. There's multiple walls through life, but you know what? These are the best gifts God could ever give you. So let me invite you to just say yes, learn from this tremendous study of Abraham, and let God take you into a transformed future that He has for you.
This is week 4 of Emotionally Healthy Spirituality. Some of you are feeling like, whoa, this has been quite the journey already, and I totally understand that. This isn't easy stuff. And I want to give you 2 things this morning before we actually start into the message. The first is a reminder, and the reminder is simply this. We are not getting up here on Sunday mornings to stand in front of you and give you our good ideas. Okay, there's lots of good ideas out there, but that's not what this is about. We are getting up here on Sunday mornings to present the truth of the Word of God to you, because that is life transforming. It's not just a good idea. It's God's ideas, and it's life transforming, and I trust that will be the case this morning as well. The second thing I want to give you this morning is permission. Permission. And what do you need permission for? You need permission to not burden yourself with giving equal weight to everything that you are learning through this journey of emotional healthy spirituality, because it's too much. It's too much. This is not a grad level course where you have to master all the material and reproduce it on an exam at the end. No, this is an opportunity for God to speak into your lives, perhaps in 1 or 2 areas that you need to hear right now. This Sunday may be one of them. For some of you, it may not be. Maybe last Sunday was a game changer for you. But my permission to you is, don't think you have to master everything 100% right now. No, that's not where you are. That's not what God is doing in your life. Maybe later there'll be another area that God will want to work on in your life. But breathe a little sigh of relief if you're thinking you have to 100% master everything that you're hearing. Some of you are in underground groups, you're reading the book, but give yourself a break. If God is working in 1 or 2 areas, then that's exactly what you want to be supportive of. So today, journeying through the wall, I'm going to open in a word of prayer, and then we will dive into this. Would you just pray with me, please? God, thank you for each one that has come today, for those that may be joining us in our online community. What we need, God, first and foremost, is to hear from you today. So would you please just open the eyes of our hearts, give us ears to hear and hearts to understand what you have for us today. And then please give us a willingness to allow you to bring transformation if that's what we need. This is about you, God, and we just submit ourselves to you and to your truth. In Jesus' name, I pray. Amen. So Pastor Peter Scazzero, the author of the book, writes an entire chapter called Journeying Through the Wall. And at the very end of that chapter, he has this quote that I'd like us to start with today. He says this: remember, God's purpose for us is to have a loving union with Him at the end of the journey. Now, the reason I like that quote is that he reminds us we are on a journey. Nobody is expected to be at a destination, but we're moving towards a destination. And along the way, we should be learning and growing and receiving whatever God has for us on the journey. The other thing that he emphasizes in this quote here is that God has a purpose. God has a purpose. And God's purpose is a relational purpose. It's been His purpose from the very beginning. And the way that Scazzero phrases it is that we would have a loving union with God. This is the relationship that God has been working on and calling us into and drawing us into ever since time began. God is a very relational God. So we're on this journey, and it's a journey into an ever-deepening relationship with God, or a loving union. Now that sounds good to me, and I imagine it probably sounds good to most of you there, but let me just tell you right now, sometimes we find that the price is a little bit more than we want to pay to be in that union with God. Because what happens is we oftentimes get our priorities wrong in our lives, and we put other things in the place that only God should hold in our lives, and that loving union breaks down. We see this theme throughout Scripture. For those of you that are familiar with the Old Testament, when God first starts to give his people some organized guidance, we call it the 10 Commandments. The very first one that he puts in there is, don't have any other gods before me. Why did he need to tell the people that? Why does he need to tell us that? Well, because God knows that we have this tendency to move things that don't belong in that place into that place to where we can actually start worshiping things that are not God. And so God reminds his people right away, don't do that. Fight against it. Jesus picks up the theme in the New Testament in Matthew chapter 6. Jesus is teaching and he says this, no one can serve two masters. Either you will hate the one and love the other, or you will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve both God and money. Now, Jesus is picking on money in this passage here, but you can take the word money out of there if you want, and you can put any number of other things in there, and the truth is still relevant. Jesus could have said, you cannot serve both God and material possessions. You cannot serve both God and security. You cannot serve both God and relationships, even good relationships like a marriage or a parent-child relationship. You cannot serve both God and vocation. None of those things are bad in and of themselves, but they're toxic when they move into a priority that they never should have been in. And sometimes, when we just don't seem to get it, God has no other choice than to bring a crisis into our lives to get our attention. In this particular context, we're calling that crisis the wall. The wall. And the title of this message today, Journeying Through the Wall. I want to look at walls this morning. A wall is not an inconvenience. Okay, a wall was not that your spouse was late getting ready for church today. That's not a wall. Okay, that flat tire you had, that's not a wall. The fact your portfolio dropped a couple percentage points in the last few weeks, that is not a wall. Those are inconveniences of life. A wall is a crisis. A wall is something that you come up against that seems insurmountable. Too high, too wide, too thick to ever get through. You wonder if this is where it ends. And for some people, it is. There are people that never move beyond the wall. They literally live the rest of their life there facing that crisis. When we come up against the wall, we start to question ourselves. Where did I go wrong? What mistakes did I make that this is happening to me? We start to question God. I thought this was a kind and loving God. Why would he allow this pain in my life? We can start questioning the church. I've been faithful and active. Why is this happening to me? There are more questions than answers. Our foundation is shaken. We don't know where God is. We don't know what he's doing. We don't know where he's going. We don't know how he's getting us there. And first and foremost, we don't know how long it's going to last. Typical walls that we or those that we love face in our lives would be things like a relationship implosion. Wait, this was permanent. I've known this person since my childhood. We were always going to be friends, and something happens, and the relationship is in pieces that can't be put back together. I made a vow to this person. I committed till death do me part, and it's over. You're at a wall. Can be a moral failure. A person who's lived a good ethical life all of a sudden makes a horrible choice, regrettable choice, and they find their world crumbling around them because of that choice. Sometimes it's a vocational catastrophe. I love my job. I'd like to retire from this job. I love my coworkers, and all of a sudden one day, over. You're gone. You're released, downsized. And there's no other job out there on the horizon for you. Have come up against a wall. Or it might be that dreaded report from your physician, where the thing that was suspected has now been confirmed, and you know that it's going to demand treatment and surgery and pain and rehabilitation and time and unanswered questions. Will I ever get beyond this physical thing? You are at the wall. And almost without exception, when we find ourselves at the wall, it's accompanied with a crisis of faith. As Doug portrayed for us in the dance here so beautifully a few minutes ago, I don't even know if I believe. This isn't the God that I had bargained for, and the foundations of our very faith become very shaky under our feet. The primary issue at the wall is almost always me versus God. Is it my will or is it God's will? Well, if it's my will, I sure wouldn't have designed it this way. Is it my way or is it God's way? And when we come down on the my side in that question, my will, my thoughts, my way, what we have done, and people, this is getting onto very dangerous ground, what we have done, we have put ourselves above God. We're saying, I know better. Did you miss what's going on here, God? Did you blink and not see? Certainly you wouldn't have done this. We're saying that we know better than God, and that is an extremely dangerous place to be. The title of this message, Journeying Through the Wall, has a subtitle, and that subtitle is Letting Go of Power and Control. And these are almost always issues when we come to the wall. We want some control. We would like to have control over our life. We want some power in this situation, and what we're asked to do is release power and control and completely trust God when we are at the wall. We're going to be looking at Abraham here in the Old Testament, in the book of Genesis this morning, because Abraham had a few walls in his life, and we're going to look at probably the most significant wall that this man faced and see what we can glean, what we can take away from Abraham's experience at the wall. Now, for those of you who may not be familiar, Abraham was a character that we meet very early on in the Bible, the 12th chapter of Genesis, and he's a sheep herder. He's got cattle and flocks and stuff like that. And God has a conversation with Abraham, and this actually becomes a pattern in their life where from time to time they actually have a conversation. And so when God meets Abraham, he says to him, Abraham, I have a promise for you and I have an assignment for you. The promise is you are going to become the father of many nations, which is really interesting to Abraham because he has no children. He's married and he and his wife have not been able to conceive. And God says, no, you're going to be the father of many nations. And then he says, and I'm sending you away from your land, from your home. You're going on a journey here. So Abraham takes off, and he goes to this land that God promises that ultimately his descendants are going to live in, and he goes to Egypt, and he moves around, and the years pass by, and still no children. And Abraham and his wife Sarah are pushing 100 years of age. They're beyond the years of childbearing. So finally, Sarah says to Abraham, look, maybe what God meant was that we would have children through a creative solution. And I've got this servant girl, this maid, and why don't we have our children through her? So Abraham, here, why don't you take my maid and sleep with her and see if God will give us children through her? Abraham says, whatever you say, dear. And so he does, and she gets pregnant, and she has a son, and Abraham and Sarah are like, oh, isn't this cool? But immediately God says, no, that was not the promise. And so then God spells it out very clearly. Abraham, the promise was to you and your wife Sarah that the two of you are going to conceive a child, and it's going to be a male, and you are going to become the father of many nations. And so Abraham and Sarah, they move around, and Abraham is gaining wealth and power. He has his own army, and he's got all kinds of flocks and herds, and he ultimately settles down, and his wife gets pregnant. and she has a child, and it's a male, and they name him Isaac, and all of a sudden, the promise is fulfilled. Isaac is the child of the promise. And we pick up the story here today. Isaac is now a teenager, and his parents have been settled for a good long time, to the point where we read that Abraham planted a tree, and wanderers don't plant trees. Settlers plant trees. Abraham is settled, and he's wealthy, and he's old, and he's content, and God has kept the promise, and he's got this teenage son he's watching grow up. Life is good for Abraham. Chapter 22 of Genesis. Sometimes later, God tested Abraham. He said to him, "Abraham." "Here I am," he replied. Then God said, "Take your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac. Go to the region of Moriah, sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on a mountain I will show you." Early the next morning, Abraham got up and loaded his donkey. He took with him 2 of his servants and his son Isaac. When he had cut enough wood for the burnt offering, he set out for the place that God had told him about. On the 3rd day, Abraham looked up and saw the place in the distance. He said to his servants, "Stay here with the donkey while I and the boy go over there. We will worship and then we will come back to you." Abraham took the wood for the burnt offering and placed it on his son Isaac, and he himself carried the fire and the knife. The 2 of them went on together. Isaac spoke up and said to his father Abraham, "Father?" "Yes, my son," Abraham replied. "The fire and wood are here," Isaac said, "but where is the lamb for the burnt offering?" Abraham answered, "God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering, my son." And the 2 of them went on together. When they reached the place God had told him about, Abraham built an altar there and arranged the wood on it. He bound his son Isaac and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. Then he reached out his hand and took the knife to slay his son. But the angel of the Lord called out to him from heaven, "Abraham, Abraham." "Here I am," he replied. "Do not lay a hand on the boy," he said. "Do not do anything to him. Now I know that you fear God, because you have not withheld from me your son, your only son." Abraham looked up, and there in a thicket he saw a ram caught by its horns. He went over and took the ram and sacrificed it as a burnt offering instead of his son. So Abraham called the place "The Lord will provide." And to this day it is said, "On the mountain of the Lord it will be provided." The writer of Genesis does us an amazing favor as the readers here in verse 1 when he says, sometime later God tested Abraham. So we know something that Abraham didn't know, that this was a test. This was only a test. Our God is not about human sacrifices. He's not about asking parents to slay their children. But our God knew there was something going on in Abraham's life that needed to be addressed. And so this test, this teachable moment for Abraham comes along. The child Isaac was a good thing. He was a blessing. He was an answer to prayer. He was God's promise fulfilled. But apparently, we see in verse 12, that Abraham had elevated Isaac to the point of worship. As Isaac had grown, as Isaac was becoming a young man, as Abraham was getting old and he was experiencing the comforts of life and the joy of knowing that he had a son, his view of God was diminishing as his view of his son Isaac was increasing to where it had turned into worship. The good thing had become the main thing in Abraham's life. And that was a place that only God could rightly hold. Abraham could not be in a loving union with God if he was worshiping something other than God. Abraham didn't hit the wall when he got to the top of the mountain and built the altar. No, he hit the wall when God gave him the instructions about what he should do with Isaac. And it's very interesting to note what the writer does with this passage. He takes us, the readers, through this detailed description of the preparation of the journey. And it was 3 days. And God didn't just tell Abraham, oh, go out behind your tent. There's a little hill there. No, you go 3 days. You walk for 3 days. You think about this thing for 3 days while you are walking. And oh, by the way, go chop the wood that you're going to make the fire with, and load the wood on the donkey, and bring the fire with you, and carry the knife, Abraham, because you're going to need it. And when they get to the spot there that God indicated, there's no altar there, so Abraham has to find the rocks, and he has to build the altar that he's ultimately going to lay his son on. All of these details let us know that for Abraham, 3 days was an eternity. Being with his own thoughts, the only one that knew what God had asked him to do, what he was about to do. Can we possibly put ourselves in Abraham's position? We can try, but it's probably really not possible for us to do that. Those of us that are parents, to think about one of our own children, it's like, I don't even want to go there. I don't even want to let my mind go there. But this is what Abraham was facing. There's 3 takeaways I'd like to point out for us in this passage today. The first one is simply this: God is present at the wall. We see that in the passage from the very beginning when he has his first conversation with Abraham. We see it along the way when Isaac asks his father, where is the sacrifice? And Abraham defaults to God, and he says, no, God is going to provide the sacrifice. And we see it at the end in the conversation that God has with Abraham and God making provision. God never abandoned Abraham through this entire experience. There were probably times where Abraham wondered or doubted, but in the end he knew, and we know, that God was always present with Abraham throughout this entire episode. The second takeaway is that God provides at the wall. God provides. He's active. He's not just observing. He is active. Think of this man who was 100+ years old, and the strength that it took for him to make this 3-day journey with all these emotions going on in his own head. God provided the strength for Abraham to even do this. We see Abraham referring to God as the God who provides, and ultimately, God provides the substitute, and Abraham names the place, the mountain, God provides. Abraham was fully aware of God's provision all along the way at the wall. God is present at the wall. God provides at the wall. And finally, God has plans beyond the wall. And I know that this is a tough one for some of us, because when we come up against the wall, it seems impossible that there's anything beyond the wall, because it just feels like, man, life as I know it is done. But no, the wall is there for a purpose, and God has plans beyond the wall. If you read on after this passage here, we find that God provides this other sacrifice. Abraham and Isaac return to their home. Abraham lives long enough to watch his son grow up into manhood, to marry his wife, and Abraham dies at an old age knowing that God is indeed fulfilling the promise that he made to him. His life was not over at the wall. There was just some work that needed to be done in that place. I'd like to make my best attempt at illustrating this wall situation with an account from my own life. As I reflect back, I can identify a few walls that I have faced. Most of them fade with time, but one of them doesn't. It's as vivid in my mind as if it just happened. And this was a few years back when my daughter was about to graduate from college. She's our youngest. Our oldest had already graduated from college, was married, and our daughter was on her way to finishing college. And we knew she had some struggles. We knew she was getting some counseling, and that was great. It was our blessing. We knew that was a good thing for her. Weren't sure what it was all about. But at some point, her counselor said to her, you need to talk to your parents about these things that we're talking about. And so she agreed and set up a time. She came home from school and met with Linda and myself. We were in no way prepared for what she was going to drop on us. Because as she started talking, she told us that when she was like 6 and 7 years old, for like a 1+ year period of time, that she was being sexually violated by an older girl. Where did that come from? I'm the dad, right? I'm the protector. This is my little girl. Where was I? How did I miss that? And God, where were you? I mean, come on, she was 6 years old. Where were you, God? We had the conversations with our kids. You parents know what I'm talking about. We talked about inappropriate touching. We talked about that they could always come to us and share no matter what. But this other individual instilled such fear in her that if you ever tell anybody about this, really bad things will happen to you and to your family. And she believed it. So she kept it all inside for over a decade. And my world got really shaky. What is this, God? Where were you? How could this possibly happen? Daughter went back to college. My wife and I were left with this news. Now, how do we deal with this? And I can tell you, we spent many, many, many sleepless nights talking, questioning, praying, wondering, doubting. But the interesting thing is, as I reflect back on that season now, we never doubted God's presence. Even though we were doubting His goodness, we kept praying. We didn't have anywhere else to go. So we kept praying to this God we weren't sure we trusted at that point in time. God was present with us throughout that whole journey. God provided for us, even as He provided for Abraham, but in a very, very different way. We were living in Tennessee at the time. I was directing a retreat center. We had about 3,000 guests a year that came, but they didn't come to build relationships with us. They came for silence and solitude and personal retreat time, family reunions, things like that. So we had very little interaction with our guests. But for some reason, shortly after we got that news about our daughter, Linda and I ran into a couple on the grounds there one day and started chatting with them. Turns out they're about the same age as us, had kids about the same age, and we were just talking and stuff, and one of them said, oh, let's go out to dinner. You guys free tomorrow night? We said, yeah. So we went out to dinner, had a nice time, came home. We were dropping them off at the little cottage they were staying in, and they said, well, would you guys like to come in for a while? It's still early. And we said, oh, okay. So we walked inside, and I can still remember it as if it was happening today. We were seated around this little round table. The four of us were there, and either Linda or me, I don't remember who, had the freedom to bring this thing up. We hadn't talked to anybody about it. We were sworn to confidentiality. We didn't have family or close friends in the area, but we felt totally safe with these people, and we brought this thing up. And then it all kind of came out. And they listened, and they asked questions, and they listened, and they prayed, and we cried, and they listened, and we talked. And by the time we left that evening, nothing changed in terms of the circumstances. All of that history was still there, but the burden on us was hugely lifted. We all of a sudden realized, no, we're not alone in this thing. And God had provided this mystery couple. I don't know their names. I don't know where they're from. I'm sure I knew their names at one point in time. God had provided exactly what we needed, flesh and blood, some real people to be Jesus in the flesh to us right when we were desperate for that. And what about God's plans beyond the wall? When we first faced the wall, I thought, it's over. Man, I'm a failure as a parent, clearly. I've got a daughter who I totally let down. How did I miss all this stuff? Can I ever forgive myself? But we got through the wall. And looking back on that now, I have to say two things about my daughter. Number one, she's one of the strongest young women that I know. And I attribute the majority of that to the experience that she went through, her healing that she received afterwards. And number two, she's one of the most compassionate people that I know. She's a school teacher, and within a day or two, she can identify the disenfranchised kids in the class, the kids on the fringe, those that are subject to bullying. She seeks them out and she empowers them because she knows what it's like to be in that place. No, God did a wonderful, marvelous healing work in her life, but what about me? What about me beyond the wall? I wasn't a pastor when this all happened. I was the executive director of a retreat center. But today, as a pastor, it's very rare that I ever sit down with anybody or with a couple and listen to their stories and interact with them and am not influenced by what happened back then. My compassion quotient, my ability to empathize with people has gone up exponentially because of going through that particular experience. Yeah, God has plans even beyond the wall, even when you don't even think it's possible to get beyond the wall. So church, let me just ask you today, where are you in terms of any walls in your life? Where are you today? And in a group this size, I would probably say there's a few of you out there who can honestly say, I don't think I've come to a wall yet in my life. And that's probably true. If that's where you are, well, you just rejoice and celebrate and thank God for that. It may change. Something different may happen later. I'm not predicting anything, but rejoice in that fact, okay? I would also say, and I know this for a fact because you've told me, some of you are at the wall right now. I know that. Some of you have shared your stories with me, and I know you are at the wall. Some of you have been there for a while, and you are wondering if this is actually a journey that's ever going to end, if you're going to get through the wall. Let me just say to you, if you're facing a wall right now, please remember and start paying attention to the fact that God is present at the wall. You may have to look a little harder than you are, but He is there. He has not abandoned you. You are not alone. God is present at the wall, and God provides at the wall. When He provided for us, we had to reach out and accept that provision. We could have just as easily said, no, we're not talking about this. We're not talking to anybody about this. But no, we took the chance and we received what God provided for us and benefited hugely by His provision. God is providing for you at the wall. He's there. He hasn't left you. He hasn't abandoned you. And He is indeed providing. Some of you have journeyed through the wall. I know that. I've heard your stories as well. And you've got a story to tell because you have been through the wall. And what I have to say to you this morning is this. You are surrounded by people who are at the wall, and they're wondering if there is another side to this. You have a story they are desperate to hear. It may be dramatically different than your story. That's fine. But your testimony of God's faithfulness, God's provision, His presence is exactly what somebody else needs to hear today. This is by design, people. This is not coincidental. God designed us to accompany each other through the wall. So can I just say to you today, be alert and be generous. When you find those people in your world who are at that place, would you just be generous with them? Be generous enough to tell your story? Even if it's a story that you would rather forget, there is so much hope in that, church, and that's what we need to be doing for one another. I want to end this morning just by mentioning Jesus. Because Jesus was born into a world where He faced wall after wall after wall. Lived His entire life facing the wall of poverty. From birth, He faced the wall of persecution as people were actually trying to take His life as soon as He was born. He faced the wall of opposition from the religious leaders in His day, and that existed His entire time here on this earth. The wall of misunderstanding from His own family members, His own siblings, and His own mother. And ultimately, When he went to the cross, he faced the wall of execution, death, pain, torture. Jesus' situation was very different from ours. He did not need to have his priorities realigned. He hadn't started worshiping something other than God his Father. No, Jesus was in a very different situation. It might cause us to ask, well, why would Jesus do that? Why would Jesus live his life facing wall after wall after wall that he didn't have to? Well, the answer is simply this: because we needed him to. And Jesus knew that by facing these walls, most notably the wall of the cross, that he was opening the door for us to be in a loving union with God. Without what Jesus did, we didn't have a chance. We were hopeless. But because Jesus opened that door, Jesus paid the price we couldn't pay, he has now made it possible for us to be in that very loving union that God has designed for us. God loves us way too much to allow us to live with our priorities out of order. And if we start putting something in the place of worship in our lives, God will do something about that. He'll do whatever it takes. He may start gently, but he might ultimately have to bring us to the wall if nothing else gets our attention. Because that's how important it is for us to be in a loving union with God. And for those of us that have journeyed through the wall, I would venture that the majority of us would say we wouldn't change it for anything. Did we enjoy the pain? No. Did we enjoy the circumstances? No. But what came out the other side, if it couldn't be achieved any other way, bring it on. Would you pray with me?